He walked into that restaurant, thinking he was meeting a stranger. He walked out knowing the woman across the table had been the reason his whole life collapsed. 7 years. 7 years of 4-hour nights, cold lunches packed before sunrise, hospital corridors, hands that never stopped bleeding from work, all of it traced back to her family's decision to destroy him rather than admit he was right. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. She didn't know either. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. Drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The restaurant was the kind of place that tried too hard. Soft amber lighting, jazz piano bleeding through invisible speakers, white tablecloths ironed into perfect submission. It was the kind of Chicago establishment where the menu didn't list prices and the waiters memorized your name between courses, a world built specifically for people who had never once worried about making rent. Ethan Mercer stood near the entrance for a full 30 seconds before the hostess acknowledged him. He was wearing the one blazer he owned, navy blue, bought 3 years ago for Sophie's school Christmas concert. Dry, cleaned exactly twice since. Collars was straight. His shoes were polished. He'd spent 20 minutes in the bathroom mirror at home trying to decide if he looked like a man going on a date or a man attending his own sentencing. Sophie had told him he looked great. Sophie was 12 and thought cargo shorts were formal wear, so he'd taken the compliment with appropriate skepticism. Reservation? The hostess asked. Mercer. Ethan Mercer. He cleared his throat. Think my friend Sandra made it. It's a blind date situation. The hostess smiled, the practiced smile of someone who had heard everything. Course, your guest has already arrived. Right this way. He followed her through the room. Past tables of couples leaning close over candlelight and business dinners where no one was actually listening to anyone else. Straightened his jacket without thinking about it. No. He tried to remember the last time he'd been nervous about anything that wasn't Sophie-related. He couldn't. The hostess stopped at a corner table, quiet, slightly removed from the rest of the room. There was a woman seated there, facing slightly away from him, her attention on her phone. Dark hair, good posture, the kind of stillness that came from spending years in rooms where stillness was power. Then she looked up, and Ethan Mercer's stomach hit the floor. He knew her face the way you know the face of someone who appears in a recurring dream, familiar, in a way that bypassed rational thought and went straight for the chest. He knew the precise angle of her jaw, the way her eyes sharpened when she was processing. Something, the small, controlled pause she made before speaking. He knew all of it because he had spent 3 years watching those expressions from across hangars and runways, from maintenance bays with engine grease on his knuckles. From the polite distance that existed between a mechanic and the daughter of the man who signed his checks. Vivienne Cross, 30 years old, CEO of Cross Aviation Group. The woman whose father had handed Ethan a termination letter on a Tuesday morning and changed the entire course of his life. She was staring at him with the exact same expression he imagined, was on his own face the specific human look of someone whose brain is working 3 seconds behind their eyes. She started. Yeah, he said. Neither of them moved. The hostess, oblivious or professional enough to pretend to be, pulled out the chair across from Vivienne and gestured toward it with a polished smile. Can I start you both with some water? Ethan sat down, mostly because his legs made the decision without consulting him. Water's fine, Vivienne said. Her voice was exactly the same. Measured, careful, the voice of someone who had learned young that how you said something mattered as much as what you said. The hostess left. The jazz piano continued its indifferent work in the background. They looked at each other across a table that suddenly felt about 6 inches wide. Sandra, Ethan said finally. Vivienne closed her eyes briefly. My college roommate. She said she had someone she wanted me to meet. Good man, she said. Reliable, doesn't complain. Wonderful with kids. She paused. She didn't mention a name. She told me the woman was accomplished. Successful. Ethan picked up the water glass the busboy had just set down, mostly to have something to do with his hands. Too busy for games. She wasn't wrong. No. Silence settled between them, like a third person at the table. Ethan set the glass down. He looked at the menu without seeing a word of it. His jaw was tight, and he knew it. He'd had 7 years to build a wall between himself and everything that had happened at Cross Aviation, and in the space of 15 seconds, Vivienne's face had knocked a hole straight through the middle of it. "We can leave," Vivienne said quietly. "Both of us. Blame a conflict. Sandra doesn't need to know." He looked at her. There was something careful in her expression, not cold, not indifferent. Something more complicated than that. Like she was already calculating the most dignified exit strategy while simultaneously bracing for whatever he was going to say. "Is that what you want?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Was always the thing about Vivienne Cross, she never answered anything immediately. "I don't know what I want," she said. "I didn't expect this." "That makes two of us." Another silence, shorter this time. "We're already here," Ethan said. He picked the menu back up. Might as well eat. He'd first seen her on a November morning 7 years ago. He'd been 3 weeks into the job at Cross Aviation's private terminal on the north side, a maintenance mechanic. One of 8 on the floor. Hired because he had credentials and a reputation for being precise, and because the previous guy had retired without enough notice. Ethan had been 25 years old, already a father for 5 years by then, already a widower for 2. He didn't talk about his wife at work. He didn't talk about much at work. He showed up, he did the job right, and he went home to Sophie. That was the whole shape of his life, and it fit him the same way a tool fits a hand, not comfortable exactly, but familiar enough to function. Vivienne had come through the hangar that morning with 2 men in suits who were clearly there to look important rather than do anything. She was 23, dressed for a board meeting, moving through the industrial space like she'd grown up in it, which, Ethan later learned, she basically had. Malcolm Cross had brought her to company events since she was a child. The airport was as natural to her as a living room. She'd stopped near Bay 3, where Ethan was running diagnostics on a Cessna Citation, and asked him something about the pressure indicator housing. He hadn't expected a real question, specific, technical, kind you couldn't answer unless you actually understood the system. He'd answered it. She'd nodded slowly, like she was filing it away. He said, 3 weeks. "Do you like it here?" He'd considered the question more seriously than she probably intended. "I like the work," he said. "The machines are honest. Either function or they don't." She'd almost smiled. And people aren't honest. Not usually. She'd moved on with her entourage. 2 days later, she'd come back through alone, asked him 2 more technical questions, and actually listened to the answer. After that, it became something of a pattern, not regular, not planned, just occasional. She was learning the company from the inside out, and she seemed to understand that the people who actually knew how things worked weren't always the ones with offices. He'd respected that. He'd been careful to keep it at respect. Waiter arrived, introduced himself as Marcus, described 3 specials that cost more than Ethan's weekly grocery budget, and disappeared again. "The salmon's good here," Vivienne said. "You've been before." "A few times, business dinners." She paused. "I never came here when I was younger. It was always a work thing." "Sure, Ethan." He looked up from the menu. "This is strange," she said. "I know what my family did to you. I knew it was wrong the minute my father handed me the paperwork, and She stopped, pressed her lips together, started again more carefully. "I'm not asking you to pretend none of it happened. I think we can have dinner, as adults, without either of us making it worse than it already is." He studied her for a moment. The woman he remembered from the hangar had been 23 and still finding her footing inside her father's empire. The woman across this table had found more than footing. She had the specific gravity of someone who had made hard decisions and lived with them. "Okay," he said. "Okay, the salmon then." She almost smiled again. "Good choice." They talked about nothing important for the first 20 minutes. This was, Ethan recognized, a survival strategy they'd independently arrived at. Weather, Chicago traffic, the ongoing disaster of the city's infrastructure. Sports teams neither of them particularly cared about. Kind of conversation you have when 2 people are circling something larger and need time to find steady ground. He learned that she still lived in the city, a condo in River North, close enough to the Cross Aviation downtown offices that she could walk on good days. He told her he and Sophie were in Pilsen, a neighborhood that had changed considerably since he'd moved there but still felt like home. "Sophie," Vivienne said. "That's your daughter." "Yeah," he paused. Always paused before talking about Sophie with someone who didn't know her. From caution more. From the specific weight of trying to describe someone who was the most important thing in your life to Crow. To someone for whom she was just a name. She's 12 now. She'll be 13 in March. Currently convinced that she wants to be either a mechanical engineer or a pastry chef. And she sees no contradiction in those options. Vivienne's expression shifted. Something warmer moved through it. Smart kid. Terrifyingly smart. Gets it from her mother. He said it without pain, which still surprised him sometimes. 2 years ago, that sentence would have caught in his throat. Her mother was the kind of person who could walk into any room and immediately understand what everyone needed. Sophie's got that. She reads people. What happened to her mother? Car accident. Sophie was 3. He kept his voice level. Facts, not performance. She doesn't remember much. Just photographs and what I've told her. She carries it differently than I do. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Time doesn't always fix things. He looked at her a real look, not the sideways assessment he'd been doing since he sat down. She said it's like someone who knew it from the inside. He agreed. It doesn't. The food arrived. They ate. The jazz piano shifted into something slower and sadder. Ethan found himself talking more than he'd expected, more than he usually did with anyone outside Sophie and the small orbit of people he'd kept close over the years. There was something about Vivienne that had always done that. Even in the hangar, she had a quality of attention that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered. He told her about Rosa Delgado, his neighbor in her late 70s, who had suffered a stroke 8 months ago and whose daughter lived in Phoenix. Yes, he'd intervened. He went by 3 times a week sometimes to help with groceries, sometimes just to sit with her while she did her physical therapy exercises, because she said it was less humiliating with someone watching than without. You don't have to explain it, Vivienne said. Why you do it. I'm not explaining it. You're doing that thing where you preemptively defend yourself against judgment. Paused. Maybe. I'm not judging you. I think it's... She stopped. Seemed to reconsider her choice of words. Rosa's lucky to have you nearby. She made me soup 3 times last winter when Sophie had the flu. Lucky runs in both directions. He watched Vivienne absorb that. Something crossed her face that he couldn't quite read there and gone. He asked. Nothing. It's just... She picked up her wine glass, turned it slightly. When my father told me you'd left, that you'd found another position and moved on. He said it in a way that made it sound like you were the kind of person who left easily, who didn't put down roots. She set the glass down. I believed him. The temperature at the table shifted. Ethan set his fork down carefully. He fired me on a Tuesday, Ethan said. His voice was still quiet, but the evenness in it cost him something. I was out of the building by noon. I had a daughter in kindergarten, no severance, and a reference letter, so vague it basically said nothing. I wasn't going anywhere. I was just gone. Vivienne met his eyes and didn't look away. Do you? I didn't know then. I know now. She exhaled. That's what I'm trying to tell you. That I know. That I found out. He waited. I started getting the full story last year, she said. During an internal audit, there were some liability concerns, nothing public, nothing that made news, but it required pulling documentation from the previous decade. Maintenance logs, safety reports, incident filings. She looked at her plate, then back at him. I found your name in a lot of places I hadn't seen it before. Ethan said nothing. There was a sound in his ears that wasn't quite ringing, more like the silence after something very loud stops. The jet, he said. The Hawker 800. December 14th. 7 years ago. He remembered it in the specific, detailed way. You remember the moments that define you not as a story, but as physical sensation. Cold of the hangar floor, the smell of hydraulic fluid, the particular quality of the overhead fluorescence at 2 in the morning when he'd finally found what he'd been looking for in the pressurization control system. A hairline fracture in the primary controller housing, visible to the eye in normal conditions. Catastrophic in sustained flight at altitude. He'd filed the report at 2:47 a.m. He'd been summoned to Malcolm Cross's office at 9 a.m. The following morning. Malcolm Cross was the kind of man who filled a room without being large. Average height, silver-haired, the build of someone who had played golf 3 times a week for 30 years. His handshake was famous in certain circles firm. Without aggression, the handshake of a man who had made everyone he ever met feel like they were in capable hands. Ethan had been in that office once before, for his hiring meeting. It had been brief and professional. Malcolm had looked at his certifications, asked 3 precise questions, and offered him the position the same day. That second meeting was different. Malcolm had been standing behind his desk when Ethan entered. Seated, standing. Ethan understood later that this was intentional. Positioning the unconscious language of power. Mr. Mercer, Malcolm said. Sit down. Ethan sat. I've read your report, Malcolm said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded the way very controlled people sound when they are angry, precise, and almost pleasant. It's a thorough document. I found a fault in the miso. I understood what you found. Malcolm picked up a pen, held it between both hands, seemed to be weighing something. What I'm struggling with is the timing. We have a departure scheduled in 4 hours. I have 8 passengers, including my daughter, and 3 clients who have flown in from London. The disruption to those schedules, sir. Ethan kept his voice steady. Pressurization controller has a fracture in the primary housing. Sustained cruising altitude, especially given the cold front moving through. Tonight, there's a meaningful risk of decompression. That's not a disruption. That's a potential. Mr. Mercer, the pleasantness thinned. I have an engineering team. I am your engineering team on the ground floor, and I'm telling you this aircraft should not fly tonight. The silence that followed lasted approximately 10 seconds. Set the pen down. His expression didn't change in any obvious way. No reddening, no visible anger. Just a slight recalibration, like a dial turning by a single degree. I appreciate your diligence, Malcolm said. I'll have someone else take a look at the unit. I'd like to be present for that review. Malcolm looked at him for a moment. Won't be necessary. With respect, I think it is. If someone signs off on this flight after my report. The report has been noted. Mr. Mercer. Ethan stood up. His chair scraped back. The aircraft is grounded pending a secondary review. That's my official position. If you want to override it, you'll need to file a written exception with my signature and a countersigning engineer. I'll have the paperwork ready within the hour. He walked out. At 11:30 that night, he got a call from Vivienne's assistant saying the flight had been canceled due to scheduling issues. At 9:00 the following Tuesday morning, he got a call from HR. Canceled the flight, Ethan said. He just didn't want to explain why. The fracture was real, Vivienne said quietly. I had an outside firm look at the archive records. The maintenance logs from the following week showed the repair. Someone fixed it and filed it under routine maintenance. Incident report. No record of your finding it. The waiter appeared to ask about dessert. Both of them declined without discussion. He buried it, Ethan said. He buried it. Vivienne's voice was careful and flat, the way it got when she was holding something difficult at a distance. Then he told me you'd found something better, that you'd given notice and left. He said it in passing like it didn't matter. I was in London for most of that January. By the time I came back and thought to ask, she paused. He'd already made it sound like a closed chapter. And you didn't push. It came out harder than he'd intended. He saw her absorb it. No, she said. I didn't push. He picked up his water glass, set it back down. I had a daughter, Vivienne. I had a kindergartner and no job, and no, I had nothing lined up. It wasn't like I had somewhere to be. He didn't fire me because of the report. He fired me because if I stayed, someone would eventually ask questions. He heard his own voice getting quieter as it got harder. Oh! That had always been his tell the quieter he got, the more dangerous the territory. He fired me to make a problem disappear. Yes, and it worked. Quiet for a long moment. Sophie got sick that same week, he said. That same week he fired me. He said it like he was laying a piece of evidence on a table. She collapsed at school on the Thursday. I was already applying to night shift positions because that's what you do when you have a kid and no income. I got the call during an interview. He paused. After that, after the hospital, after the first 3 weeks of tests, none of the rest of it seemed particularly important. Vivienne was very still across from him. What was it? She asked. That's if you're okay saying. Atrial septal defect. A hole in her heart they hadn't caught at birth. Minor enough that she'd functioned normally for 5 years. Severe enough that it needed surgical repair. He exhaled slowly. She was in the hospital for 11 days. Surgery was the 8th day. She was home by Christmas. Vivienne said nothing for a long moment. The restaurant moved around them. Voices, silverware, a burst of laughter from a table near the window, and neither of them were part of any of it. She said, I know you didn't. If I had, he said again, and he meant it not as forgiveness, not yet, but as fact. You couldn't have known what you weren't told. She picked up her wine glass. Didn't drink from it, just held it. I'm sorry, she said. Quiet and direct, and she didn't dress it up. That doesn't fix 7 years. I'm not saying it does. But I need you to know that I'm sorry for my part in it, for not asking harder questions, for accepting the version of events that was convenient. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back at him with the same steadiness she'd had in that hangar at 23, that quality of attention, that willingness to hold difficult eye contact without flinching. I hear you, he said finally. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't absolution, but it was something. The waiter brought the check without being summoned, the way good waiters sense the end of a conversation. Ethan reached for it out of reflex. Vivienne put her hand on the folder, first not grabbing, just placing. Statement. Let me, she said. He considered arguing. Decided against it. Not because he couldn't afford dinner, but because some battles consumed more energy than they were worth, and he had learned a long time ago to pick carefully. All right, he said. She handled the check with the practiced efficiency of someone who did it constantly. He watched her and tried to reconcile the person in front of him with every version he'd constructed of her over 7 years, the villain's daughter, the naive heir, the woman who hadn't looked hard enough. Of those versions were quite accurate. None of them were quite wrong, either. People were more complicated than the stories you told yourself about them. Sophie had told him that last summer. She was 12 and already understood things that had taken him 32 years to half figure out. Outside, the city was cold and loud and ordinary. They stood on the sidewalk in the November air, their breath briefly visible between them. I'd like to talk again, Vivienne said. Not to continue arguing. There are things I want to tell you. Things that might make this worse before they make it better. She paused. But I think you deserve to know them. He looked at her face. She wasn't asking for anything except the option. Yeah, he said. She nodded. Okay. A cab went by. Someone's music leaked out of a nearby bar. Couple walked past them, arguing in low, urgent voices about where to eat. Ethan put his hands in his jacket pockets. One of them found an old receipt from a grocery run, and he'd forgotten it was there. And for some reason, that small, ordinary thing was grounding in a way he needed right then. My daughter's going to ask how it went, he said. Something moved across Vivienne's face, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. What will you tell her? He thought about it, honestly. That it was complicated. And that complicated doesn't always mean bad. He walked to his car. He drove home through the lit-up city, through the familiar streets of Pilsen, past the taqueria on the corner that was still somehow open at 11 on a Wednesday, past Rose's building where one light was still on in her first-floor window. He pulled into his parking spot, sat in the car for a minute. He thought about a pressurization controller with a hairline fracture in a hangar 7 years ago. He thought about Sophie's face when she'd asked him that morning if he was nervous. He'd told her no. He'd lied. He got out of the car, climbed the stairs to their apartment, and found Sophie asleep on the couch with the television on and her homework half finished on the coffee table. He turned off the TV, moved the notebook, put a blanket over her. She stirred.
Yeah, how was it?
He sat on the edge of the couch. She turned to look at him with one eye half open, a 12-year-old who always waited up, even when she couldn't. It was a lot, he said. She seemed to accept that as a complete answer. Was she nice? He thought about Vivienne's face when she said, I'm sorry, the plainness of it, the way she hadn't dressed it up. She was honest, he said. I think that might be better than nice. Sophie closed her eye again. Okay, Dad. He sat with her until her breathing steadied back into sleep. Outside, Chicago kept going the way it always did, indifferent and relentless and full of people carrying things no one else could see. Stayed on the couch a while longer. He didn't sleep well that night. That wasn't unusual. Ethan Mercer hadn't slept well in years, not in any sustained, restful way. That Wednesday night, after the restaurant, it was worse than the ordinary restlessness. He lay in the dark, staring at the water stain on his bedroom ceiling that he kept meaning to fix, and listening to the city outside the window and trying to put Vivienne Cross back into the compartment where he'd been keeping her for 7 years. Compartment wouldn't close. He got up at 4:30, which was only slightly earlier than usual, and made coffee in the kitchen while the apartment was still dark and quiet. He stood at the counter drinking it and looking at nothing in particular, turning the evening over in his mind the way you turn a stone over in your hand, checking from the underside, testing its weight. She hadn't known. That was the part he kept returning to. The apologies he'd received before, in various forms, from various people, and had learned to evaluate with appropriate skepticism. What he kept returning to was the specific texture of her not knowing. The way she'd said, "He told me you'd found something better," with the particular flatness of someone who had recently discovered they'd been handled, like she was still getting used to the shape of it. He poured a second cup of coffee he didn't need and thought about Malcolm Cross, which was something he usually made an effort not to do. He thought about that office, that handshake, that particular variety of pleasantness that certain powerful men wore like a coat warm and well cut and entirely impenetrable. Thought about Sophie asleep on the couch, yet asleep on the couch, sticking out from under the blanket, her homework notebook, open to a page of geometry problems she'd been working through before she fell asleep. Her pencil had rolled onto the floor. He'd picked it up without thinking and set it on the coffee table. He thought about the week after she collapsed, the hospital smell, the specific sound of a cardiac monitor when you've been listening to it for 6 straight hours. The doctor who had come to explain the procedure using words Ethan had written down because he didn't trust himself to remember everything through the particular kind of fear that makes your thinking go sideways. Thought about how none of that had anything to do with Vivienne Cross, and also how none of it could have happened the way it happened if her father hadn't put him out on the street with 2 weeks of back pay and a vague reference letter. Both of those things were true at the same time. He finished his coffee, went and packed Sophie's lunch, made her the turkey sandwich she actually liked rather than the more nutritious option she would eat without complaint but didn't choose. Cut it diagonally, because she'd told him once, at age 7, that diagonal made it taste better, and he'd never been able to prove her wrong. By the time Sophie wandered into the kitchen at 7, rubbing her eyes, he'd already been up for 2.5 hours. "You made the good sandwich," she said, looking at her lunch bag. "Make a thing of it." She sat down at the table and poured herself cereal, watching him with the kind of sidelong attention she'd inherited from her mother, the look that said she was assessing something without wanting you to know she was assessing it. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine. You're doing the coffee thing." "What coffee thing?" "Where you stand and drink it, but you're not really drinking it. You're just holding the cup." He looked down at the mug in his hand. She was right. He set it on the counter. "I'm fine," he said again. Sophie ate her cereal. She let the silence sit without filling it, which was not a 12-year-old quality she'd come by. Naturally, he'd watched her work at it over the years, consciously choosing to leave space the way he'd watched her, consciously choose to read difficult books. She was building herself on purpose. It sometimes made him feel very proud and very unequal to the task of raising her simultaneously. "Was she someone you knew before?" Sophie asked. He looked at her. "The woman from last night," she said. You get a certain look when something's tangled up with the past." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He thought about deflecting. He thought about the simplified version. There is no simplified version. Then he thought about how Sophie had a way of detecting simplified versions at 100 yards and resenting them. "We worked in the same place a long time ago," he said, "before you got sick. I didn't know she was the person Sandra had set me up with." Sophie absorbed this with the stillness that meant she was deciding how far to go. "Was it bad when you worked together?" "No, we barely knew each other." He paused. "What happened after I left that job that was complicated? Complicated like you don't want to talk about it, or complicated like you need time? Complicated like I'm still figuring out what I think about it." She nodded. That was enough for her, apparently. She finished her cereal, rinsed her bowl. He'd been making her do that since she was 8, and picked up her backpack from the hook by the door. "Dad," she said from the doorway. "Yeah, complicated isn't always bad." "You say that. I say a lot of things. Most of them are right, though." She shrugged the backpack onto one shoulder. "See you tonight." He listened to her footsteps on the stairs, heard the front door, sat at the kitchen table with his cooling coffee, and thought about his daughter, who was 12 years old and already wiser than he was about certain things, and whether he deserved that. He decided the question wasn't useful. He got up, changed, and went to work. The job was in an industrial park in Cicero, a maintenance contract for a manufacturer of commercial HVAC, 8 months running. Glamorous, not well-paying by any standard he'd been aiming for when he was 22 and earning his certifications, but steady, reliable. The machines didn't have opinions, and the foreman, a heavy-set Croatian man named Davorin, who communicated primarily in grunts, didn't require conversation. Ethan was good at the work in the way you get good at something when you've been doing it out of necessity for long enough that it stops feeling like a choice. He could diagnose a failing compressor unit the way a doctor hears a lung, not by running through a checklist, by the quality of the sound, the feeling in the air nearby, the small wrongness that preceded a larger collapse. He'd learned that at Cross Aviation. Spent most of that Thursday under a decommissioned rooftop unit that needed its condenser coils replaced, his back against the metal surface of the housing, working with the specific economy of movement that comes from years in tight spaces. The wind off Lake Michigan was cold enough that his fingers had gone half numb by noon, as he worked about 7 years ago, about the version of himself that had been fired on that Tuesday, and walked to his car in the Cross Aviation parking lot, carrying a box of personal items, 2 coffee mugs, a framed photo of Sophie at 3, a set of calibration tools he'd bought himself. That man had sat in the car for a while before driving. He'd been angry in the way that people who rarely get angry, a deep, tightly compressed fury that had nowhere particular to go. Driven home, called his friend Marcus, who worked at a competing firm and might know of openings, and started his job search that same evening. He'd been efficient about it because efficiency was how he handled things that threatened to undo him. And then 4 days later, Sophie's teacher had called. The way he remembered it now, the two things had fused in his memory into a single catastrophe: the job, the hospital, the surgery, the recovery, the months of night shifts and daycare arrangements and casseroles from Rosa next door, who had been 69 then and still sharp as a tack, and had taken one look at him in the hallway and said, "You look like a man who hasn't eaten in 3 days." And been exactly right. He'd gotten through it the way he got through most things, by not looking up, by focusing on the next task, the next hour, the next morning, by making Sophie's lunches before sunrise and reading her stories when she was recovering, and by not allowing himself to think too far ahead, because too far ahead was where the despair lived. He'd survived, but somewhere in the surviving he had put himself away somewhere. Dramatically, no with any conscious decision. It happened the way these things happen, gradually and practically. He stopped looking for positions in aviation because those jobs required references he didn't have anymore, and the Cross name was attached to enough of his professional history that interviews got complicated. He moved sideways into general industrial maintenance. He got good at it. He stopped thinking of it as temporary. He turned 30. He turned 31. Sophie lost her first tooth, and then all the rest of them, and grew new ones. Rosa had a knee replacement, and he helped her with her rehab exercises 3 times a week. Marcus got married and had a son, and Ethan was the godfather, which was an honor he took seriously and interpreted practically. He showed up. He fixed things. He remembered the kid's birthday. Life was not bad. That was the honest answer when he checked. Life was genuinely not bad. His daughter. Yes, his neighborhood, his work, his small circle of people who mattered to him. He wasn't surviving anymore. Exactly, he was living, in all the quiet, particular ways that living happened when you weren't paying attention. But he was also, he knew, keeping a very careful amount of distance between himself and anything that might require him to want things too specifically. He replaced the condenser coil and climbed down off the roof and ate his lunch in the work van because it was too cold to sit outside, and he called Rosa to check on her afternoon PT appointment. "I haven't forgotten," she said, with the particular sharpness of someone who'd been managing her own affairs for 7 decades and didn't need reminding. "I'm not saying you forgot. I'm checking in. You're mothering me. Someone has to." A pause, then the sound of her faint smile. He could hear it even over the phone. "How was your date?" Word traveled fast in a building where the walls were thin, and Rosa knew everyone. "It was fine. Fine is what people say when they don't want to say the real thing. Fine is what I say when something was genuinely fine, Rosa. You sound like you slept badly. I sleep badly every night. It's a baseline condition, Ethan." Her voice shifted, not softer exactly, but more direct. The way it got when she wanted to say something real. "You're allowed to have things go well. You understand that. You've been so careful for so long not about keeping everything manageable. Maybe let something be a little unmanageable for once." He looked out the windshield at the gray industrial sky. "You're very wise and also very annoying." "I know," she said. "Pick me up at 3:30. He picked her up at 3:30. He sat in the waiting room of the physical therapy clinic and read a 2-year-old magazine article about kitchen renovations. He had no interest in and felt unexpectedly a small, sharp thing in his chest that took him a moment to identify. It was loneliness, not the heavy, drowning kind, the quiet kind that appears when everything is fine and you suddenly notice that fine and full are not the same word. He drove Rosa home. She told him about the PT session. Her left arm was getting stronger, she said, though the cold made it ache. He helped her up the stairs and made sure she had what she needed. She pressed a container of leftover chicken soup into his hands at the door and told him it was Sophie's, not his, which was her way of saying it was both of theirs. He went upstairs and started dinner. He texted Vivienne at 6:15. He'd been thinking about doing it since he woke up. He'd been arguing with himself about it since lunch. He lost the argument, finally, because Sophie came home from school and dropped her backpack and said, "Smells like you're actually cooking tonight," with a level of surprise that he found slightly offensive. And something in the domesticity of that moment made the text seem less momentous than it had felt all day. "You mentioned there were things you wanted to tell me. I think I'd like to hear them." He watched the little dots appear almost immediately. Stop, then appear again, then stop, then the reply came. "I'm free Saturday afternoon if that works. There's a coffee place on Damon near Division, not fancy." He looked at it, thought about it for about 4 seconds. "That works." Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Who are you texting? Your ears are red." "Cold in this apartment." "Dad, the heat is on." He turned back to the stove. "Go do your homework." She went loudly, making sure he could hear her, absolutely not making a big deal of this. He stood over the pasta and tried to get his expression under control, not because anyone was watching, but because he believed in practicing things even privately. Saturday came after a Friday that moved the way Fridays move when you're waiting for them to be over, not badly, just with a certain resistance. He picked Sophie up from her friend Emma's house at noon, listened to a detailed and surprisingly dramatic account of a disagreement in their friend group that he couldn't quite follow but made supportive noises about out, and dropped her at his friend Marcus's place, where she would spend the afternoon with Marcus's son. Jalen was 9 and thought Sophie was the coolest person he'd ever met, which Sophie tolerated with practiced humility. Back by 6, Ethan told Sophie, "I know, Dad, and don't teach Jalen anything Marcus wouldn't approve of." She stopped, reconsidered. "I'll be good." Coffee place on Damen was exactly what Vivienne had said, not fancy. A narrow storefront with mismatched chairs, an exposed brick, and a chalkboard menu, and a particular smell of espresso and old wood that Chicago did better than almost anywhere. Vivienne was already there when he arrived, at a table near the back window, her hands wrapped around a mug. She'd traded the corporate precision of their first meeting for something slightly more relaxed: dark jeans, a gray sweater, hair down rather than arranged. She looked, he thought, more like herself, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant, given that he'd only known a version of her. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He got coffee at the counter, just black, nothing elaborate, and came back and sat down. They looked at each other for a moment. The awkwardness of the fresh was still there, but quieter now. Less like the shock of impact, and more like the soreness that comes after. "I was going to plan what I wanted to say," she said. "I made notes, actually. Then I decided that was overcalculating, and I deleted them." He said, "I do that. It's a flaw. Planning what to say isn't necessarily a flaw. Planning what to feel is." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "'Kay." She looked out the window for a moment, at the street, at the gray autumn afternoon, at nothing particular. Then she looked back at him. "After you left," she said, and stopped. Adjusted. "After my father told me you'd gone. I was in London for most of January, running a review on our European charter operations. I was 23, and I'd been given more responsibility than I probably should have had at that age, and I was trying to prove I could handle it, and I didn't have bandwidth for things that weren't directly in front of me." She said it plainly, without making it an excuse. "When I came back, I asked about you once. My father's assistant told me you'd given your notice and relocated. I accepted that, and you didn't ask again. I didn't ask again." She turned the mug slowly on the table. "But I thought about it, more than I'd like to admit. About the night of the jet, about the way you'd talked to my father, because I found out, later, that you'd told him the aircraft shouldn't fly. Politely, specifically, and I'd assumed you did it, and left, because you'd decided The job wasn't worth the trouble. Said nothing. He was listening, really, the way he did when he needed to understand something fully before deciding what it meant to him. It made me think less of you, honestly, she said, for a while. And then I stopped thinking about it because I had other things. That's fair. It's not, though. That's what I keep coming back to. She met his eyes. I knew you not well, not personally, but I knew what kind of work you did and how you did it. I watched you tell my father his jet shouldn't fly, and I knew enough to believe you were right. The minute someone told me a clean, convenient version of events that let me move on, I moved on. She paused. That's not fair to you. It's not who I want to be. There was a man at the counter ordering something complicated, and the barista was explaining it patiently, and the coffee machine made a long, steady noise. Normal afternoon. Normal place. The two of them in it having a conversation that was 7 years overdue. What did the audit show? Ethan asked. She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant she was deciding how to organize something she'd already organized many times in her own head. The maintenance log for the Hawker 800 showed a condenser housing repair, filed as routine maintenance in the week following your report, she said. Your incident report, the one you filed at 247A, had been removed from the central filing system. Printed copy existed in a subfolder of physical archives that hadn't been scanned. The audit scope had been even slightly narrower. We'd never have found it. Ethan was very still. There's more, she said. Tell me. You weren't the only one. Over the period my father was managing operations, directly a stretch of about 4 years, there were 2 other maintenance employees who filed significant safety concerns and were terminated within 30 days. One of them later filed a complaint with the FAA. It was investigated and closed with no action taken. She stopped. Watched him. I don't know exactly how far it goes. That's part of what the audit is still working through. He sat back in his chair. He thought about that Tuesday morning, the termination letter, HR's carefully neutral tone, the box of personal items. He thought about it with the particular vertigo of understanding that something which had felt personal and specific was actually part of a pattern. He hadn't been singled out by bad luck. He'd been managed. He ran the operation that way, Ethan said. Not a question. My father prioritized schedule and reputation over process, she said, in ways that I think he told himself were reasonable business judgments, and in ways that I think he also knew were not. She didn't look away from him. I've been trying to reconcile those two things about him for a year. I haven't gotten very far. He's still your father. The word came out with its full weight. He is. Ethan looked at his coffee. He thought about what it might mean to discover your father had been systematically doing the wrong thing and telling you a different version for years. Thought about the kind of love that didn't stop just because you found something out. But he didn't envy her that. I'm sorry, he said, for your part of this. That's yours to carry, and it's not light. She looked slightly surprised, as if she'd been braced for something harder and hadn't expected this. I'm still angry, he clarified. I want to be clear about that. I'm not. This conversation doesn't resolve everything. But I can be angry about what happened, and also so recognize that you got hurt in it too. Have to do that. I know I don't have to. She was quiet for a moment. Okay, she said. They drank their coffee. Outside, a couple walked past with a dog pulling hard at its leash. The dog was very interested in something on the other side of the street and was not at all interested in going anywhere the couple wanted to go. Can I ask you something? Vivienne said. Probably. The years in between. After you left, after you were let go. What did you do? He considered how to answer that. Strategically, just in terms of what was true and what was relevant. I worked nights at an industrial facility for 2 years while Sophie was in school during the day, he said. I slept between 1 and 5 in the afternoon, more or less. I got certifications in additional systems because the aviation work was off the table, and I needed to be worth hiring in other sectors. He turned his mug on the table, mirroring what she'd done earlier without thinking about it. Eventually, I got into contract maintenance work. Steer. Great money, but predictable, which, with a kid, is worth more than you'd think. And Sophie, after the surgery, she recovered well. Better than the doctors expected, actually. She was back in school by January, he paused. She doesn't remember much of it. She was 5. She knows it happened because I've told her, but she doesn't have a before and after the way I do. Is that better, that she doesn't remember? I think so. For her, he thought about it. She doesn't have it as a weight. She just is who she is, without the origin story attached. He paused again. That's the thing about kids. They're just relentlessly themselves. And the things that would break an adult, no, they just walk through and come out the other side and ask what's for dinner. Vivienne smiled at that, a real one, not the careful, practiced variety. Changed her face. She sounds like someone I'd like to know, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Maybe someday, he said, and surprised himself by meaning it. The afternoon light through the window had gone a deeper gold, the particular slant of late autumn sun that appears briefly and has no warmth in it but looks beautiful anyway. Ethan drank the last of his coffee. He was going to have to leave soon, 6 o'clock at Marcus's Sophie's dinner to make, the week's worth of logistics that never stopped requiring management. There's a letter, Vivienne said. He looked at her. I wrote it 7 years ago. After I came back from London and started to understand that something felt wrong about the way my father had explained things. I wrote you a letter. She said it evenly, watching him. I never sent it because I didn't have an address, and I told myself I didn't have enough information, and both of those things were true and neither of them was the real reason. What was the real reason? She considered this honestly. I was afraid of what it would open. I was 23, and I'd just gotten real authority inside my father's company, and I was trying to prove I belonged there, and the idea of pulling at that thread. She stopped. Convinced myself I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment never came, and eventually I stopped thinking about the letter. But you didn't get rid of it. No. A pause. I found it again when I found your file in the audit. I've been carrying it around for a month, trying to decide if giving it to you was the right thing or just something I needed for myself. What did you decide? I decided you should get to decide. She reached into her bag, a practical leather bag, the kind with a lot of pockets, and took out an envelope. Off-white, not sealed. She set it on the table between them and kept her hand on it for a moment, then moved the hand away. You don't have to read it now. You don't have to read it at all. It's yours. He looked at the envelope. He didn't pick it up immediately. Yes, he looked at his name on the front, Ethan Mercer, in her handwriting, slightly more hurried than he'd have expected. Picked it up and put it in his jacket pocket. Thank you, he said. Thank me. It's 7 years late and probably makes me look worse, not better. Why give it to me? She looked at him steadily. Because it's true, and because the last 7 years have taught me that keeping true things to yourself to manage truth candies, how people see you, is exactly the kind of choice that causes the most damage in the long run. He thought about his father, who he barely thought about anymore, and then about Malcolm Cross, and then about all the ways people learn the wrong lessons from the men who raised them, and all the ways some people manage to unlearn them. He stood up, put on his jacket. I have to get my daughter. Of course, Vivienne. He stood at the edge of the table. Whatever the letter says, I'm glad you gave it to me. Once. Not relieved exactly. Something more private than relief. He walked out into the cold afternoon. He had 40 minutes to get to Marcus's place in Wicker Park. He walked to his car and sat in it for a moment with the engine running and the heat beginning to work its slow way through the vents, and he did not take out the envelope. Yet, he drove through the city with the envelope in his jacket pocket, close to his chest, and he thought about the specific weight of a truth that had spent 7 years looking for somewhere to land. Sophie was exactly where he'd left her sitting, on Marcus's front steps with Jalen, the two of them arguing about something. No, with the intensity of people who fundamentally agreed, but had found a disagreement to work through anyway. She looked up when his car pulled up, and her face did the thing it always did, that quick, involuntary happiness that she was starting to learn to moderate with 12-year-old cool, but hadn't quite managed yet. He was grateful for that. He hoped it lasted. She climbed in and immediately started telling him about a video game Jalen had been playing that she thought had a seriously flawed logic system in its third act. Yes, he'd intervened, and he listened, and made the right noises, and drove them home, through the early evening city, past the lit windows and the corner stores and the ordinary ongoing life of the neighborhood. And he thought about Vivienne Cross, sitting in a coffee shop with a mug between her hands, and the letters she'd carried for 7 years. Some things you hold on to, not because you mean to, but because putting them down requires knowing where to set them. He'd figure that out. He had time. And this was the thought that followed him up the stairs, and into the apartment, and into the business of making dinner, while Sophie set the table and complained about geometry. Maybe time wasn't the resource he needed. Yes, he'd intervened. Maybe it had never been about time. He put the water on to boil and didn't think about the envelope and thought about it constantly. And eventually, when Sophie was doing homework at the table and the apartment was quiet enough, he went to his room and sat on the edge of his bed and took it out of his pocket. He held it in both hands. He did not open it. Not tonight. Tonight he had dinner to finish, and a daughter who would want to watch something on television after, and Rosa to check on in the morning, and a Monday shift that started at 7. He set the letter on his nightstand. He went back to the kitchen. Sophie looked up from her homework. Pasta smells good. It's the same pasta I always make. I know, it still smells good. He stirred the pot and listened to his daughter work through a problem she'd been stuck on, muttering the logic under her breath, until it untangled, and felt the particular specific weight of a life that was not everything he'd planned, and was nonetheless, in this moment, enough. The letter sat on the nightstand. Tomorrow, maybe, or the day after, when he was ready to let 7 years land somewhere. He read the letter on a Sunday morning, 4 days after Vivienne gave it to him. He'd picked it up twice before that, once the night she gave it to him, once on Friday after Sophie had gone to school, and both times he'd set it back down on the nightstand without opening it. He wasn't sure what he was waiting for, exactly. Some particular quality of readiness that hadn't arrived yet. He'd learned a long time ago that pushing yourself toward things before you were ready usually just meant you processed them badly and had to do it twice. Sunday morning, Sophie at Emma's for a sleepover. She'd come home from around noon. The apartment quiet in the specific way it got. When she wasn't in it, a different kind of quiet than nighttime. More absence than peace. He made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, with the winter light coming through the window at a low, flat angle. Put the envelope in front of him. Opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, slightly cramped in the way of someone who writes faster than their hand wants to go. The date at the top was January 19th, 7 years ago, 6 weeks after he'd been fired. Ethan, I don't know if I'll send this. Yes, I'm writing it because I need to say it somewhere. Because I need to say it somewhere. And because I'm starting to understand that what my father told me doesn't add up, and I don't know yet what to do with that. You were right about the hawker. I know you were. I knew it when you filed the report, and I knew it when my father told me the flight was canceled due to scheduling. Those are not the same thing, and I let myself pretend they were. He read slowly. He wasn't a fast reader under normal circumstances. He'd always been the kind of person who went back over sentences to make sure he had them right before moving on, and this he read more carefully than anything he'd read in years. She wrote about the weeks after January 1st, after she'd come back from London, the particular unease she'd had when her father mentioned his departure too casually, too cleanly, the way you mention things you've already decided the other person shouldn't look at too closely. She wrote about asking one question, just one, and accepting the answer she got. I think I knew, even then, that I was accepting it because it was easier. I had just been given real authority at the company, and I was afraid that pulling at anything would make the whole structure question whether I belonged there. That's the honest version. I keep trying to find a better-sounding reason, and I keep coming back to that one. I don't know where you are. I've thought about finding out. It's not like it would be impossible. Your personal file still exists, but I keep stopping myself, and I can't entirely explain why. Maybe because finding you would mean having to say this out loud, and I'm not sure what I'd say after it. What I want to say is you were right. You did your job correctly. You protected people, including me, and my father treated that as an inconvenience. Know everything he did or didn't do after that, but I know he made it easy for me not to ask questions, and I let him. I'm sorry. That's the whole of it. I'm sorry, and I don't know if that means anything. If you ever come back, I know that's unlikely, but if you do, I'll be here. He sat with the letter for a while after he finished it. Coffee had gone cold. The winter light had shifted. He could hear someone in the apartment above his doing something that involved rolling something heavy across the floor, which happened periodically and which he'd never been able to explain. No. He thought about 23-year-old Vivienne Cross sitting somewhere and writing 3 pages in cramped, hurried handwriting and then not sending them. He thought about what it cost a person to write the truth and then fold it into an envelope and put it in a drawer. He thought about all the things people did with truths that were too complicated to deliver. He'd done it himself in forms about different things. He didn't feel what he'd expected to feel, or rather, he felt several things at once that he couldn't put in any particular order. There was the anger, still there, steady and familiar. There was something that was almost grief. He couldn't quite name what for. For the years, maybe, or for the two people they'd both been. Underneath both of those, unexpectedly, something that was very close to relief. She had known. Even then, at 23, without the full evidence, she had known something was wrong. She had looked at the convenient version and felt its edges, and understood that it didn't quite fit. She hadn't acted on it. He wasn't forgiving that, but she had known. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. Called her. She picked up on the second ring. "Hi. I read it," he said, a pause. "Okay, thank you for writing it. Kevin, 7 years ago. Even if you didn't send it." He looked out the window at the street. A woman was walking a dog that had stopped to investigate something on the curb with complete commitment. "I think I needed to know you'd written it." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been wondering for a week what I'd feel when you said that." "What do you feel?" "Tired," she said, "and I don't know. Less like I've been carrying something, which I know is not the point. Point is that you, Vivienne." He said her name the way you say someone's name when you need them to stop and listen. "I'm still angry. That's not going away in the next 5 minutes. But I understand some things better now. That's not the same as being okay with it." "Something." "Yeah," she said. "It is." He heard her exhale on the other end of the line. "Relief. Something more complicated than relief." "Can we meet again?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Immediately. No calculation." "Yes, I'd like that." They met the following Saturday, then the one after that. They settled into a pattern that neither of them named, which was the only way either of them could manage it without overthinking it into paralysis. Coffee sometimes, a walk along the river once, which was cold enough that they'd lasted 45 minutes before retreating to a diner on Wacker, where they'd sat for 2 hours over mediocre cheeseburgers and talked about things that had nothing to do with Cross Aviation, her experience running. The European Review, his early years doing commercial aviation maintenance before Sophie was born, a book he'd been reading about the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad that Sophie had given him for his birthday because she'd read it first and decided he needed to. He was careful. He was always careful. It was the thing he'd been most over the years: careful, controlled, precise. He'd had to be. But underneath the careful, something was happening that he noticed in the way you notice a change in the weather before you see the clouds and the quality of the air, in some shift in pressure you can't quite explain. He thought about Rosa saying, "Let something be a little unmanageable for once." He thought about that. It was on their 4th meeting, a Tuesday evening, which was unusual, a Saturday. She'd texted asking if he had time, and he'd said yes without thinking about whether it was a good idea that she told him what she hadn't told him yet. They were back at the coffee place on Damon. He'd come from work, still in his work clothes, had managed a quick change of shirt in the van, which he felt slightly self-conscious about, and also felt slightly self-conscious about feeling self-conscious about. She was there when he arrived, already at the same table near the back window. She looked like she'd come from the office, the put-together version of her jacket, the quality of attention that came from a day of decisions. She had something in front of her on the table, a manila folder, thin but not empty. He sat down, looked at it. "What's that?" "Part I haven't told you yet," she said. He ordered coffee. She waited. "My father didn't just file your incident report in a physical subfolder and forget about it," she said. "He had it officially removed from the active system, and he had a note added to your personnel file." Ethan was very still. The note described the reason for termination as professional conduct concerns, including failure to follow supervisory direction. She kept her voice level, factual, the voice she used when she was controlling something difficult by keeping it at a professional distance. That language in the industry, with most aviation maintenance employers, is close enough to a misconduct flag that it would have made getting references extremely difficult. It wasn't a lie you could directly contradict. It was ambiguous enough to be defensible. Coffee arrived. He didn't touch it. "He tanked my references," Ethan said. "He made them unusable." She opened the folder slightly. "I've had a legal team looking at this for 3 months. There are grounds for a formal challenge, a correction of record at minimum. We can document the actual circumstances, document that the safety report was valid and acted upon, and have the conduct notation removed and replaced with an accurate termination record." She paused. "If you want to pursue that." He was quiet for a long time. Coffee shop moved around him, the espresso machine, the low conversation at the counter, the front door opening and letting in a blast of cold air that reached their table in the back. He sat in all of it and felt something moving through his chest that was too large and too various to name simply. 7 years. He'd spent 7 years not understanding why the aviation references hadn't worked. He'd made calls, sent applications, gotten interviews that went well right up until the point they didn't. And he'd always attributed it to the market, to timing, to the particular bad luck that seemed to follow certain stretches of life like weather follows a front. He'd eventually stopped applying to aviation positions because the ratio of effort to result didn't make sense, and he'd told himself it was a practical decision. It had been a practical decision, but it had also been made in the context of a game where Zinfran changed the rules without telling him. He made sure I couldn't come back, Ethan said. His voice was very quiet. Even if I'd wanted to. Yes, because if I came back, there was a chance someone would ask questions. He picked up his coffee, put it down. He fired me to protect himself, and then he made sure I stayed gone to protect himself. He could hear something in his own voice that he didn't usually let out, not quite anger. Something with more sharp edges than anger. That's not a business decision. That's deliberate, she said again. She didn't try to soften it. He respected that. Does he know you're doing this? The audit. The legal review. She met his eyes. No, not the full scope of it. A pause. My father stepped back from day-to-day operations 2 years ago. Nominally, he's still on the board. In practice, he plays golf and makes calls, and I manage the company. She said it without bitterness and without pride, just as geography. When I started pulling the thread on the maintenance files, I didn't tell him why. I told him it was routine liability review. And when this becomes something formal, the correction of record, she said it steadily. He'll know I found it and that I chose to correct it. That's a conversation I'm going to have with him, and it's not one I'm looking forward to. Something moved behind her eyes, not weakness, but the specific weight of a thing you understand clearly and don't want anyway. The right thing to do, and I'm done deferring the right thing because of its complications. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Why? He asked. Because it's the right. Why now? The audit started a year ago. You found my file months ago. You've had a legal team on this for 3 months. Why tell me now? Why not just correct the record and let me know when it's done? She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he knew she'd asked herself the same question. Because you deserved to know what was done to you, she said. Just that it was being fixed. The full shape of it. She looked at her coffee, kept thinking about what it must have felt like to apply for jobs, to get close, and then not understand why things fell through. To just not know. She looked back at him. Not knowing is its own kind of damage. I wanted to give you the full picture, even if it's harder. Thought about all the interviews, the ones that had gone well right up until the reference check. Positions he'd been qualified for and hadn't gotten. He chalked it up to a dozen different explanations over the years, all of them plausible, none of them the true one. It was harder, he said. I know. You could have just fixed it quietly. But you didn't. She held his gaze. I told you before. Keeping true things to yourself to manage how people see you. That's the pattern I'm trying to break. Even when the true thing makes me look worse. He exhaled. He turned his mug on the table, a habit he'd apparently picked up from watching her do it. "Okay," he said. "Okay, you'll let us pursue the correction? Okay, I understand why you told me." He paused. "And yes, do the correction." She nodded. She wrote something in a small notebook she'd taken from her jacket pocket, one line. Brief, like a box she'd been waiting to check. "There's something else in the folder," she said. He raised his eyes. She didn't open it. She left it on the table between them and looked at him with the particular directness he'd come to recognize as her real register, not the CEO, not the chairman's daughter. The woman who'd come into a maintenance hangar at 23 and asked real questions because she actually wanted real answers. "I've been working with my board to establish a scholarship and vocational training program," she said, "for kids from working-class families. Kind of
program
that gives technical skills real, certified employable skills, and covers costs that make it actually accessible. Tuition, materials, certification fees." She paused. "Then in development for 8 months. We have funding. We have partnership commitments from 3 community colleges. What we don't have, what I've been struggling to find, is someone who actually understands what those family understands, what those look like from the inside. Is what the training needs to be, what the actually obstacles are, what it actually takes to go from where those kids start to somewhere sustainable. She finally opened the folder. Inside was a single-page document, a proposal. His name wasn't on it anywhere, but the role described on it was so specifically shaped around a person with as background and his experience and his particular history that he felt something go still in him. I want you to help design the practical training component, she said. Run it, not a corporate title. Just be the person in the room who knows what those students are going to need, because you've lived the version of it that doesn't have a safety net. She looked at him carefully. How this looks. I know it looks like I'm trying to compensate for what happened with a job offer, and I need you to know that's not what this is. Program was in development before I found your file. Want you involved because you're the right person, not because it helps me feel better about my family. He looked at the proposal page, the maintenance and technical skills component, hands-on training, real equipment, industry certification pathways. Nothing theoretical about it. The kind of training that assumed the students had pressure on them, financial, familial, temporal, and designed itself around those constraints, rather than ignoring them. It was good work. He could see that in one read. He could also see the places where it needed someone who'd actually been in those constraints, not observed them from outside. I need to think about it, he said. Of course. That's not a no. She almost smiled. I've gotten better at reading which of your silences are which. He looked at her. Something about that, the casualness of it, the familiarity it implied, landed somewhere unexpected. Have you, he said, somewhat. The almost smile became more definite. You go quiet in a specific way when you're angry. That's different from when you're thinking. The angry quiet has more jaw in it. More jaw in it. Can't explain it better than that. It just does. He shook his head slowly. He wasn't smiling. He was still carrying too much from the last hour of conversation for anything simple, but the thing in his chest had shifted slightly. Made a small amount of room. I have to pick Sophie up, he said. You have to go. He put on his jacket. He'd picked up the folder she'd clearly intended for him to take it and tucked it under his arm. Vivienne. He stood at the table, jacket half on. What your father did, I want to be straight with you about something. I'm not going to be able to separate that from who you are to me. Completely. Not because I'm holding you responsible for his choices. Because those years happened. Sophie's surgery happened. The job interviews. All of it. And your name is attached to the family that set all of that in motion, even if you didn't know. He watched her face, which was very still and attentive. Know what to do with that yet. I don't know how to factor it, but I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist, just because I also... He stopped. She waited. He started again. Just because I also think you're someone worth knowing. Something in her face shifted, not dramatically, just a small movement like a door opening slightly to check what's outside. That's more than I expected you to say tonight, she said. He said, me too, honestly. He walked out into the cold. He sat in his car and didn't drive anywhere for about 3 minutes. Just let the engine warm up and looked at the coffee shop window and thought about the specific difficulty of being a person who had been careful for so long that even the things he wanted scared him. His phone buzzed. Sophie, can Emma come over for dinner? She says her parents won't care, but they'll definitely care, asking anyway. Stared at the text. Shh. He thought about Vivienne's folder on the seat beside him, and the corrected personnel record, and the training program, and the letter that was on his nightstand, and 7 years of careful distance from anything he couldn't control. He texted back, Emma can come, tell her parents it's pasta. He pulled out of the parking spot and drove. 3 days later, he got a call from a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer. He had a policy about unknown numbers that Sophie had inherited and improved upon, but something made him pick up. Mr. Mercer? A man's voice. Older. Controlled in the way of someone who was accustomed to being the one who called people, not the one who was called. He knew the voice before the name. He'd only heard it in a handful of conversations 7 years ago, but some voices had stayed. Mr. Cross, he said. A pause. Not a long one, just long enough to establish that the pause was deliberate. I understand my daughter has been in contact with you, Malcolm Cross said. I wanted to reach out personally. Ethan had pulled over. He didn't remember deciding to do that. His body had just made the choice to be stationary for this conversation. He was parked in front of a dry cleaner on 18th Street, and a woman was coming out with a stack of plastic-wrapped shirts, and the ordinary afternoon was continuing in every direction. She has, Ethan said. Good. I'm glad she's been transparent with you about the audit findings. The voice was measured, the golf handshake quality, even over the phone. I want you to know that any irregularities in the filing of your personnel records they were administrative oversights rather than deliberate. Mr. Cross, Ethan's voice was the quiet version, the dangerous quiet. Exactly what they were, and so do you. Another pause. Longer this time. I handled a difficult situation imperfectly, Malcolm said. I can acknowledge that. Can you? I was under considerable pressure at the time. The operational stakes. I had a daughter in kindergarten, Ethan said. He wasn't yelling. He was absolutely not yelling. He was sitting in a parked car on 18th Street, in full control of his voice, which had cost him something. I had a daughter in kindergarten and no job, and a reference file you'd poisoned, and she collapsed in school 4 days after you fired me. And you're calling me to tell me it was administrative oversight and operational pressure. Silence. I'd like to discuss a settlement, Malcolm started. I'm going to stop you there, Ethan said. I'm working with your daughter on getting my record corrected. That's the conversation I'm having. If there's a legal process that follows, I'll deal with that through whatever channels are appropriate. He paused. But I'm not going to sit on the phone with you right now and let you make this manageable for yourself. You don't get that from me. A very long silence. I see, Malcolm said. Goodbye, Mr. Cross. He ended the call. He sat in the parked car and looked at the dry cleaner across the street and breathed evenly, through his nose, the way he'd learned to do in the hospital waiting room 7 years ago when Sophie was in surgery, and the thing that would undo him was the specific act of breathing too fast. He didn't text Vivienne about the call right away. He sat with it for an hour. He drove home. He made dinner. He helped Sophie with a history paper about the labor movement, which had enough irony in it given his afternoon that he had to work to keep his expression neutral. And after Sophie had gone to bed, he finally texted, "Your father called me." The response came back in under a minute. He told me, "I'm sorry, I didn't know he was going to do that." "Did you tell him we'd been meeting?" "No. He found out through other channels." "He has people." A pause. "Then are you okay?" He thought about that. His honest answer, "I'm not okay," he typed. "I said what I needed to say." "I don't think he liked it." "He didn't." Another pause. "For what it's worth, I think he's scared. Not of you specifically. Of what comes out. That's his problem to deal with." And then after a moment, "I know this is a lot. All of it. If you need to step back from any of it, I understand." He read that text several times. He thought about what it said and what it didn't say. He thought about the coffee shop and the folder, and I've gotten better at reading which of your silences are which. "I don't want to step back," he typed. He sent it before he could overthink it. He stared at the screen. "Good," she wrote back. Just that. He set the phone down on the nightstand, next to the envelope that still lived there. He'd been meaning to put it somewhere more permanent, a box, a drawer, somewhere that felt like a decision rather than a pause. But it had become part of the nightstand's particular landscape, and he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing things that have become fixtures. He noticed it now. He lay back on the bed and looked at the ceiling with the water stain he kept meaning to fix, and he thought about Malcolm Cross's voice on the phone, the smoothness of it, the way it had shifted from management to apology to settlement in the space of 90 seconds, always reaching for the lever that would make the situation controllable again. He thought about Vivienne, who had grown up with that voice as the primary authority in her life, and who had still sat across a coffee table from him and said the full shape of it, and meant it. He thought about Sophie, asleep in her room with her history paper on the desk, and her half-finished geometric proof on the floor beside it, her pencil where she'd dropped it when she got tired. He thought about the proposal in the folder on his kitchen table, the one with his professional history's absence written into its shape so clearly that he'd felt seen and unsettled by it in equal measure. Wasn't ready to make a decision about any of it. For the first time in a long time, not being ready didn't feel like failure. It felt like standing at the beginning of something real and having enough sense not to rush it. He turned off the light. The city moved outside the window. He slept not well, but better than the week before, which was the way things tended to go when you'd said the true thing and survived the saying of it. Progress, Rosa would have called it. Small but actual. He'd take it. The folder sat on his kitchen table for 11 days. He moved it twice, once to the counter when Sophie needed the table for a school project, once back to the table when the counter got crowded with the particular accumulation of a household that was always slightly behind on putting things away. Didn't open it again after that first read in the coffee shop. He didn't need to. Yes, he'd read it carefully enough the first time that he could reconstruct the proposal page from memory, which he did. He did. Involuntarily, at odd moments waiting for a compressor unit to cycle through its diagnostic sequence, sitting in the physical therapy waiting room with Rosa, standing in the shower at 6 in the morning, while Sophie was still asleep. The program was good. That was the honest assessment he kept arriving at, no matter what angle he came at it from. It was well-structured, well-funded, and aimed at exactly the kind of gap that had no good reason to exist, but existed anyway, the space between a kid from a working-class family who was good with his hands and smart about systems and a career that could actually support a life. Scholarship covered certification fees. The partnership with 3 community colleges meant credit that transferred. Practical training component was the piece that was still unformed, still theoretical, in a way that training for people without safety nets couldn't afford to be. He what it needed. Because he'd needed the same things 25 years ago, and gotten some of them, and not gotten others. And the ones he hadn't gotten had cost him in ways that were still occasionally visible if you knew where to look. That was the problem with saying no. He couldn't say no and pretend he didn't know. Called Vivienne on a Thursday evening, 11 days after the coffee shop, while Sophie was in her room on a video call with Emma that had the particular intensity of a conversation that needed privacy. This deed. He stood in the kitchen with the folder open in front of him and dialed before he finished deciding, which was the only way he'd learned to make certain kinds of decisions. She picked up on the third ring. There was office noise behind her voices, the specific sound of an open-plan workspace winding down for the evening. "Hi," she said. The office sounds dimmed, like she'd moved somewhere quieter. Pause. Then, yeah, the training component. I'll help design it. He kept his voice level. This was a decision, not a performance. I have conditions, tell me. I'm not an employee. I'm a consultant on this specific piece, and when the design work is done, we evaluate whether there's ongoing involvement. I'm not signing anything open-ended. That's reasonable. I want final say on the practical curriculum, not consensus, not committee. If I say a module needs to be built a certain way because that's what actually works in the field, it gets built that way. Also reasonable. I'll need you to document your reasoning so it survives the next board review, but the substance is yours. He stopped. This was the one he'd been turning over the longest. My involvement doesn't get used in any press material. My name, not my background, not the story of what happened between me and your company. I'm not a redemption narrative. I'm just someone who knows how to build the training. A longer pause this time. I understand why you're asking that, she said carefully. And I want to honor it. But I want to be honest with you, there may be a point where the program's funding or public support benefits from being transparent about its origins. I'm not going to make you a story without your consent. But I also can't promise that context never becomes relevant. He appreciated that she hadn't just agreed. Agreement would have been easier and less useful. Fair, he said. We deal with that if it comes up. Okay, he could hear her settling into something not relief exactly, but the particular quality of attention that meant she was taking something seriously. When can you start? I need 2 weeks to sort out my current contracts. Can't just walk off a job mid-project. That's not how I operate. I wouldn't expect you to. After that, I can give you Saturdays and 1 weekday evening to start. This grows into more, we renegotiate. That works. A pause. Yeah, thank you. Don't thank me yet. I'll probably disagree with your education consultants about half the time. I'm counting on it, she said. That's exactly the point. He hung up and stood in the kitchen looking at the folder. Sophie's door was still closed, the sound of her conversation, a low, ongoing murmur through the wall. He thought about calling Marcus to tell him. He thought about telling Rosa. He decided he'd tell them when there was more to tell, when it was something concrete rather than a decision that could still be walked back. Close the folder. He thought about a parking lot 7 years ago and a box of personal items and the specific quality of a Tuesday afternoon when everything changes and you don't understand yet how much. Then he thought about the training program's practical component the section labeled Hands-on Technical Skills Pathway, and all the things it still needed. And he felt something that had been dormant for a long time begin to turn over like an engine catching on a cold morning. Hope, exactly. Too early for hope, but something in that direction. The first meeting with Vivienne's program team was on a Saturday morning in mid-December, in a conference room on the 14th floor of the Cross Aviation downtown offices, a building Ethan had been to twice before in his career, both times briefly, both times as the kind of person who signed in at the lobby desk and waited. He signed in at the lobby desk and waited. He was aware that this was slightly ridiculous. He was 32 years old, and a decade past the point where office lobbies should make him feel like a man in the wrong place, but awareness didn't entirely solve the feeling. He'd intervened. He stood near the window and looked out at the December street below and reminded himself that he was there because he knew something the people upstairs needed to know, not because anyone had done him a favor. Vivienne met him at the elevator. She was in work mode, not unfriendly, but efficient, the kind of focused she got when she was moving through a day with a lot of moving pieces. She shook his hand in the lobby, which was a slightly formal choice that he understood immediately. They were colleagues today. That was the frame they were both operating in, and the frame was useful. The team's already up there, she said as they rode the elevator. 6 people, 2 from program development, 1 from finance, our external education consultant. Her name is Dr. Patricia Osi. She's very good, and she will push back on everything you say, which I'm telling you in advance because it's useful, not surprising. I can handle pushback, I know. I'm telling you anyway because her pushback style is very specific. She leads with data, and she'll ask for your citations. My citations are 25 years of working in the field. That's what I told her you'd say. And? She said experiential data is still data if it's properly contextualized. So she's actually on your side. She just shows it in a complicated way. He almost smiled. I can work with that. Conference room was large and clean with a view of the city that was objectively impressive and that Ethan registered and filed away with the part of his brain that cataloged things without spending time on them. The 6 people around the table were the specific variety of professionals who worked on programs designed to help people who were not like them, meaning they were smart, well-intentioned, operating with a fundamental gap between their theoretical understanding of the problem and its actual texture. He'd been that person's client before. He knew the type from the receiving end. Dr. Patricia Osi was 60 compact, wearing glasses on a beaded chain and an expression of careful evaluation. She looked at him the way a good diagnostician looks at a new patient thoroughly and without pre-commitment. Mr. Mercer, she said, Vivienne tells me you have a specific vision for the practical training component. I have a specific understanding of what doesn't work, he said, which is different. That's a useful distinction. She wrote something on the legal pad in front of her. Tell me what doesn't work. He sat down. He took the folder from under his arm and opened it to the page he'd annotated in the margins over the past 11 days in his increasingly illegible handwriting, the one where the practical training section was outlined. This, he said, pointing to the section header, 8-week intensive technical skills module, is built around a student who can afford to learn full-time for 8 weeks. That student doesn't exist in the population you're trying to serve. The students you're trying to reach are working 25 hours a week while they train. Some of them are supporting a parent or a sibling. Some of them have kids. 8 consecutive weeks of intensive assumes a kind of availability they don't have. Dr. Osi was writing. And your alternative? Modular. 12 to 16 weeks, but the modules are self-contained units that can be completed in blocks. Miss a week because your car broke down or your kid was sick. You pick up at the next module, not from the beginning. The skills still build sequentially, but the structure doesn't punish real life. Silence around the table. The 2 program development people were exchanging a look. That extends our timeline significantly, the finance person said. He was young, mid-20s, with the careful voice of someone who had recently learned that his job was to say no to things. Our community college partners have commitments based on the 8-week model. We renegotiate the commitments, Ethan said, or we build a program that looks good on paper and doesn't work for the people it's supposedly for. Silence. He's right, Dr. Osi said. She said it the way someone states a calculation result, not warmly, just accurately. I've seen the 8-week model fail in 3 similar programs. The attrition rate in the 4th and 5th weeks is consistently high, and it correlates with external obligations, not with student capability. She looked at the finance person. We restructure. The finance person looked at Vivienne. Restructure, Vivienne said. And that was the meeting's first real pivot. There were more. He disagreed with the equipment list, too much simulation, not enough actual hardware, because the students needed to know what real machines felt like under their hands, and no simulation fully replicated the specific physical feedback of a system under load. Yes, he disagreed with the mentorship structure. Pairing students with industry professionals they'd meet over the program's course was not mentorship. It was networking cosplay. Mentorship meant regular contact, which meant finding people who had actual time, not just prestige. He disagreed, carefully and with specific reasoning, with the certification pathway that the education consultant had mapped out, because 2 of the certifications on the list were industry recognized, but not actually sought by the employers who were most likely to hire graduates of this program. Dr. Osi pushed back on most of it. Twice she asked for his citations. Twice he gave her experiential data, contextualized actual numbers where he had them, honest acknowledgement of his sample size where he didn't. She accepted the ones that held up and noted the gaps clearly, which he respected. By noon, they had rebuilt half the program's practical structure. He drove home with his notes on the seat beside him and ate a sandwich he'd made the night before and thought about how it had felt to be in that room. Not comfortable, he was too aware of the gap between himself and the people around the table, the different way they had arrived at that conference room, and the different things they'd had to navigate to get there. But useful. He'd felt for the first time in a long time specifically useful in a way that his regular work didn't quite satisfy. That feeling was unfamiliar enough that it made him cautious about trusting it. He told Sophie about it over dinner that night. Not all of it, not the Vivienne piece, not the full history, but the work itself. Program, what it was for, what he'd spent the morning doing. Sophie listened with her full attention, which was one of her better qualities. She didn't interrupt. She ate her pasta and tracked what he was saying and waited until he'd said the whole of it. So you're going to help build a program for kids who need what you needed, she said. That's a simplified version, but yes. Why is that a simplified version? That's what it is. He considered arguing, decided against it. That's what it is. She was quiet for a moment. She pushed some pasta around her plate in a way that meant she was thinking, not being difficult. Do you feel weird about it? She asked. Because of where it's coming from. He looked at her, 12 years old, and she could find the pressure point of a thing in one try. He said honestly, a little, because of Vivienne's dad, because of the whole situation. She nodded slowly. But the work is real. The program is real. Those aren't the same as the company. They're not. So she shrugged. Not dismissively, she used the shrug, the way some people used punctuation, to indicate that the conclusion was self-evident. The work is worth doing, regardless of who handed you the door. He looked at his daughter for a moment. You know, he said, you're going to be a problem for people when you grow up. You're going to walk into rooms and make everyone feel very clearly in the wrong. She grinned. Yeah, probably. She picked up her fork again. Is Vivienne nice? The shift was so deliberate and casual that he almost missed it. She's a good person, I think. Think or you know? I'm still working on the distinction. You like her, Sophie. I'm not asking you to marry her, Dad. I'm asking if you like her. He picked up his water glass, set it back down. Yeah, I like her. Sophie nodded as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. Okay, she said, and went back to her dinner with the serenity of someone who had made their point and didn't need to labor it. He did the dishes. He thought about the meeting, about Dr. Osi's legal pad covered in notes, about the program structure that was still evolving and already better than it had been. He thought about the conversation with Sophie and the specific quality of relief that came from saying a true thing out loud to someone who received it without drama. He texted Vivienne after the dishes were done. Meeting went well. Your Dr. Osi is formidable. The reply came back quickly, which he was starting to notice was her pattern when she was still at the office, fast responses, efficient. She told me you held your ground on the modular structure and that you were right. Coming from Patricia, that's essentially a standing ovation. She also told me your margins notes were illegible. He looked at his annotated folder. The handwriting was genuinely difficult. I write fast when I'm thinking. She said the same thing. Think she liked you. I'll try not to let it go to my head. Pause. Then, how are you doing with all of it? Today was a lot. He thought about that. His honest answer again. He'd been trying to give those consistently, at least to her. I feel like I said something useful today, he typed. I haven't felt that specific way in a while. It's a strange thing to sit with. Good strange or bad strange? Just strange. I'll let you know which. He could almost feel her smile through the phone. Fair enough. Get some sleep, you two. He put the phone down and sat in the quiet apartment and let himself feel, without immediately trying to categorize it, the particular texture of the day. The meeting. Sophie at the dinner table saying, the work is worth doing, regardless of who handed you the door. The folder full of notes on a program that didn't exist yet, but was to, and was going to be better for his presence in it. The weeks that followed had their own particular rhythm. He finished his existing contracts, this HVAC facility in Cicero, a shorter job in a printing plant in Bridgeport, with the same precision he brought to everything. Because leaving work half done was not a thing he was capable of, even when he was impatient to move forward. He went to 2 more Saturday meetings with the program team. He had 3 separate long calls with Dr. Osi, which he approached like academic seminars, and he approached like technical briefings, and which somehow met in the middle. She sent him 2 papers on vocational education outcomes in underserved populations. He read them both. He sent her back 3 pages of response with specific points where his field experience matched the data, and specific points where it didn't. She called him the morning after he sent it. You wrote 3 pages, she said. The second paper had some gaps in the sample. I know. Testing whether you'd notice. A pause. You noticed. Was that a test? Everything I do is a test, Mr. Mercer. You're passing. She hung up. He stared at the phone for a moment, then put it away and went back to the compressor unit he'd been diagnosing. The professional record correction moved through its legal process with the particular slowness of anything involving institutional documentation and lawyers on multiple sides. Vivienne's legal team was handling it. She gave him updates when there were updates, and fills the silence with reassurances when there weren't, which he appreciated. He'd had enough of being managed. What he didn't expect was the call from an aviation firm in Oak Brook. Came on a Tuesday in January, a recruiter, not a direct call, which meant the process had found him rather than him finding it. The firm was looking for a senior maintenance supervisor. The recruiter mentioned the position's specifics, the compensation, the team size. Then she mentioned, almost in passing, that the firm had recently seen his updated professional record, and that it addressed concerns that had previously made his application history complicated. He sat with the phone and processed what that meant. Vivienne's legal team had moved faster than he'd expected. Correction was live, and whoever had been keeping a professional distance from his resume because of conduct notation that Malcolm Cross had planted there 7 years ago was now, apparently, looking at a different document. He thanked the recruiter and said he'd think about it. He meant it, he would think about it. But the thought that struck him first, in the immediate moment after hanging up, wasn't about the position or the compensation. It was about all the applications he'd sent in the years after Cross Aviation. All the ones that had gone quiet in a way he'd never been able to explain. All the careful adjustments he'd made to his career expectations, the sideways moves and the lowered ceilings, and the practical recalibrations he'd told himself were just adult realism. All of it stacked against a note that Malcolm Cross had added to a file. He sat in his van in the parking lot of a factory in Bridgeport and let himself be angry about it in a way he hadn't allowed himself before, not the managed anger. The compressed and functional kind he'd been carrying for years. The full, clear, unmanaged version. So he sat with it for 10 minutes. He didn't do anything with it. He just let it be what it was. Then he went back inside and finished the job. Told Vivienne about the recruiter call that evening. They were on the phone, known to one of the calls that had become routine, not every night, scheduled, regular enough that neither of them acted surprised when it happened. Correction went through, she said, earlier than expected. The other party didn't contest it once the supporting documentation was complete. The other party being your father. Yes, he heard what she wasn't saying, that it had been a decision, a deliberate one, that Malcolm had made to let it go rather than fight it. Whether that decision came from some recognition of wrongdoing or simply from the pragmatic calculation that contesting it would cause more damage than accepting it, Ethan didn't know. He wasn't sure it mattered. The Oakbrook position, Vivienne said carefully. Is that something you're considering? I don't know yet. It's a good firm. Their safety record is, I know their record. I've looked at them before. He paused. I'm not going to jump at the first door that opens just because the thing that was blocking them got removed. That's not a good reason to make a decision. What is a good reason? He thought about it. Whether it's where I actually want to be. Silence. Then and where do you actually want to be? He looked out the window. Of his apartment at the street below the ordinary Pilsen evening, the corner store lit up, the couple walking a stroller, a kid on a bicycle navigating the sidewalk, with more confidence than was probably warranted. I want to finish what I started with the program, he said. I want to see actually exist, not just be planned. A pause. And I want to know if what I'm building here, the work, and everything else, to know if it's actually something before I make any large decisions. He'd said more than he intended to say. The line was quiet for a moment. Okay, Vivienne said. Her voice was careful and not indifferent. Seems like a reasonable way to think about it. It might look like hesitation, or it might look like someone who's learned to tell the difference between a door worth opening and just a door. She paused. Those aren't the same thing. No, he said. They're not. He went to bed that night and lay in the dark and thought about Sophie at the dinner table. The work is worth doing regardless of who handed you the door, and about Rosa saying let something be a little unmanageable for once, and about Vivienne's voice on the phone saying that seems like a reasonable way to think about it, with a specific quality of patience that wasn't passive. That was a person actively choosing to give someone the room they needed. He thought about his late wife, Claire, who had been the kind of person who made decisions fast and committed to them completely, and never second-guessed, and how he had always been the opposite, slower, more careful, more likely to turn something over 30 times before putting it down. They'd balanced each other in the specific way that two very different people do when they actually work as a team, and losing her had meant losing that balance. He'd learned to manage without it. But managing without something and not needing it were different things. He reached over to the nightstand. The envelope was still there, in the exact spot it had been since the night Vivienne gave it to him. He'd read the letter. He'd processed what it said. He should have moved it to somewhere more deliberate by now, a keepsake box, a file, something with intention. Picked it up and held it in the dark. He thought about Claire's wedding ring, which lived in his toolbox, not in a case, not prominently, just in the deep flat drawer at the bottom, where he kept calibration tools he didn't use often. He'd put it there 2 years after she died, because having it on the nightstand felt like a memorial and he didn't want his life to be a memorial. He'd told himself he'd find somewhere better for it when he figured out what somewhere better meant. He hadn't figured it out yet, but the question he noticed was asking itself differently now than it had been asking itself 6 months ago. He set the envelope back on the nightstand. Outside, the city ran on without him, way cities do, indifferent and continuous and full of people making decisions in the dark about what they were willing to want. Closed his eyes. He had a Saturday meeting in 2 weeks, a training module structure, to rebuild from the middle section out, a recruiter's call to return or not return, and a daughter who was going to ask him over breakfast whether he'd texted Vivienne last night and would pretend not to be asking. He fell asleep. The morning came the way mornings do, earlier than you want it, lighter than the dark prepared you for. He got up. He made coffee. He packed Sophie's lunch turkey sandwich, diagonal, and stood at the counter while the coffee worked, and the apartment was still quiet, and thought about a training program that didn't fully exist yet, and the students who were eventually going to walk into it, carrying all the weight that working-class kids carry, looking for a door that actually opened. He thought about being one of those kids a long time ago in a different city, is the set of skills and no clear path to use them, and the particular specific feeling of knowing you were capable of more than anyone had yet given you a real structure to demonstrate. He knew what the training needed. He was going to build it right. That much, at least, he was sure of. Sophie came into the kitchen, evaluated the coffee situation, poured herself orange juice instead, and sat down at the table. You're in a different mood, she said. Am I? You're standing differently. Less like you're holding something up. He looked at her. When did you get this observant? I've always been this observant. You just usually change the subject. He sat down across from her with his coffee. I'm okay, he said. And then, because she would know if it wasn't entirely true and he'd taught her to value honesty, I think I might be getting better than okay. I'm not completely sure yet. Sophie considered this with the seriousness it deserved. That counts, she said. Yeah, he said, it definitely counts. The vocational training center opened on a Saturday in late April, which meant Chicago gave them one of those mornings that felt like an apology for the entire winter clear sky. Genuine warmth, kind of light that made the city look like it had been cleaned overnight and put back carefully. Ethan arrived 40 minutes early. He told himself it was practical. He wanted to make sure the equipment in the demonstration bay was properly set up, wanted to walk through the space before it filled with people. Both of those things were true. They were also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that he needed 40 minutes alone in the building before anyone else arrived to stand in that hadn't existed 8 months ago and understand that it was real. The center occupied the ground floor of a building in Humboldt Park that had been a print shop, then empty, then briefly a warehouse for a company that went under. The renovation had taken 4 months. He'd been involved in specifying the equipment layout, not the renovation itself, his area, but the configuration of the practical training bay, the placement of the diagnostic stations, specific choice of which systems the students would work on first and why. He'd argued for real commercial equipment over educational simulators, won that argument, and spent 2 Saturday mornings helping the installation crew position things correctly, because the installation crew had been given plans that assumed a slightly different spatial relationship between the workstations. Then, actually made sense for the workflow he'd designed. He stood in the middle of the training bay now, in the early morning quiet, and looked at it. It was not perfect. The lighting on the east side was slightly insufficient, and he'd flagged it twice, and it was being addressed, and it hadn't been fully addressed. One of the diagnostic workstations had a monitor at a height that was going to be uncomfortable for anyone under 5'7", which was a significant percentage of the population they were serving. Intervened, and he'd submitted a note about adjustable mounting that was apparently still in the facilities queue. Storage system for small components was adequate, but not ideal. All the ways it fell short of what he'd envisioned on paper. He also knew that the students who came through this bay in 3 weeks, when the first cohort began, would have access to equipment and instruction and a structured pathway that he had not had at their age. That they would leave with certifications that meant something in the actual job market. The modular structure meant the ones who were working 25 hours a week to support a family would not be automatically filtered out in week 5 by a timeline that didn't account for their lives. He stood there for a while and let it be what it was, imperfect and real, which was the most reliable description of anything worth having. Rosa arrived before anyone else, which surprised him even though it probably shouldn't have. She'd told him 2 days ago that she was coming, and Rosa Delgado had a relationship with punctuality that made Ethan's own look casual. She came through the door with her cane and her good coat, the navy one she wore to occasions, and found him in the training bay and looked around the space with the specific evaluating attention of a woman who had spent 40 years as a school administrator and knew immediately what a space was for and whether it was built right. "Show me," she said. He showed her. He walked her through the bay, explained the workstation layout, described the module sequence. She asked 3 questions, all of them precise, all of them about things that weren't visible in the equipment, but in the thinking behind it. Why this sequence rather than another? What happened to a student who entered with more advanced background knowledge? How the mentorship structure was actually going to work in practice rather than on paper. He answered them all honestly, including the ones where the honest answer was, "We don't know yet. This is the first cohort. We're building the feedback loop as we go." Rosa nodded at that last one, as if it was the most acceptable answer he'd given. "Good," she said. "Anyone who tells you they've figured out education before they've taught anyone is lying." He walked her to one of the chairs set up in the reception area and got her a coffee from the catering table that had been arranged near the entrance. She accepted it and looked at him over the rim of the cup. You look like yourself today, she said. I look like myself every day. Usually you look like a version of yourself that's managing something. Today you just look like you. She sipped her coffee. It's an improvement. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. He went to check on the equipment bay one more time, which was unnecessary and which he did anyway. People arrived in steady increments after 8. The program team doctor, OC, in a different pair of glasses, but the same beaded chain, the finance person, whose name was Derek and who had turned out to be more flexible than his initial manner suggested, 2 program development staff who had quietly become allies across months of Saturday meetings, community college partners, 3 of them, the department heads who'd signed off on the credit transfer agreements that had taken 6 weeks longer than scheduled to finalize, local press, 2 reporters. Modest rather than extensive, Vivienne had been deliberate about the scale of the coverage. A handful of city council contacts, representatives from the 3 employers who'd committed to interview program graduates for open positions, and families. That was what the morning was really for. Families from the neighborhood, Humboldt Park, Pilsen, Englewood, Austin, who had kids who had already been accepted to the first cohort, who had come in their good clothes on a Saturday morning to see the place their son or daughter was going to spend the next several months. They moved through the space with the particular alertness of people who were evaluating whether a promise was real or just a well-dressed version of the usual runaround. Ethan watched them move through the training bay. A woman in her mid-40s stood at one of the diagnostic workstations and touched its surface lightly, checking its solidity the way you check a foundation. A man Ethan's age stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the equipment with the expression of someone who recognized it, who had worked with systems like this, and understood what learning them meant for his kids' options. Ethan knew that look from the inside. He was standing near the back of the bay, when a boy 17 maybe, slight build, watchful quality of someone who had learned to read rooms quickly, came over and stood near one of the diagnostic stations without quite touching it. That's an HVAC diagnostic interface, Ethan said. Commercial grade. The kind you'd find in a mid-sized commercial building. The boy looked at him. Does it actually work? All the equipment is functional. You'll be running real diagnostics, not simulations. The boy looked back at the station. My uncle does this work. He's been trying to get certified for 2 years, but the courses cost too much, and he can't take time off. Program covers certification fees, Ethan said. Designed for people who are working. You don't have to quit your job to attend. Nodded slowly. Not enthusiastically, more like someone who had heard promises before and had learned to measure them against something more solid than words. My uncle should have come today, he said. Tell him to look at the adult track, Ethan said. First cohort is 18 to 24, but we're opening an adult pathway in the second round. Should be running by fall. The boy looked at him directly for the first time. You work here? Ethan thought about how to answer that. I helped build the training part of it, he said. The way the courses are structured. Why? It was a direct question from a 17-year-old who expected a direct answer. Ethan gave him one. Because I was where you are a long time ago. I knew how the machines worked, and I couldn't find a clear path in. And someone made my path harder than it needed to be. He paused. I figured if I could make it cleaner for other people, I should. The boy held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, a small, real nod. Nothing performative about it, and moved away to look at the next station. Ethan stood there a moment. He thought about that parking lot 7 years ago. The box of personal items, the specific weight of a Tuesday that rearranged everything. He thought about the boy's uncle, trying to get certified for 2 years, the cost too high, and the time unavailable. He thought about how many versions of that story existed in this city, in every city, the specific way that the path got made artificially narrow for people who couldn't afford to wait for it to widen. He thought about Malcolm Cross's voice on the phone saying operational pressure and administrative oversight. He thought about all the small, careful acts of erasure that had accumulated into 7 years. He stopped thinking about it because Sophie was walking in through the front door. She was with Marcus and his wife, Diane, them son Jalen, who was wearing a button-up shirt that he was clearly uncomfortable in, but had apparently agreed to, and Sophie was wearing the dark green jacket she'd bought herself with babysitting money in February and had been unreasonably pleased with ever since. She scanned the room, with the quick efficiency she'd had since she was small, found Ethan across the space, and her face did the thing, the involuntary thing, before the 12-year-old cool had a chance to moderate it. She waved. He waved back. She said something to Marcus and came across the room, navigating the crowd with the ease of someone who'd been accompanying her father to work-adjacent things since she was old enough to walk and had learned early how to move through adult spaces without getting in the way. "This is really something, Dad," she said when she reached him. She looked around the bay seriously. "This is actually really something." "Start." "No, I mean it." She looked at him. "I can feel what it is. What it's for." She said it plainly. Without drama, the way she said things she meant deeply. You can tell when a space was built by someone who cared about getting it right. He looked at his daughter, who was 13 in a month, was going to be formidable, and was already more than halfway there, and felt something in his chest that was too large for the moment and exactly right for it at the same time. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Obviously I came." She gave him a look that communicated the absurdity of that sentence. "Is Vivienne here?" "Not yet, but she's coming." "She's coming." Sophie nodded, satisfied, and went to find Jalen, who had located the catering table and was conducting a very serious evaluation of the pastry options. Vivienne arrived at 9:15, which was 15 minutes before the formal program was scheduled to begin, and 30 minutes after most people had arrived. He saw her come in, saw her, the way he'd noticed. He'd started seeing her, which was immediately and without having to look for her, some peripheral awareness that registered her presence before he consciously directed his attention. She was with 2 members of her board, which was the appropriate professional framing for this morning. She was here as the program's founder and funder, and she was managing that role with the same careful precision she brought to everything. Through the room, in the way he'd watched her move through rooms, over months of meetings, attentive, efficient, warm in a way that didn't feel performed, genuinely present with each conversation, rather than working through a list. She saw him across the room, held his gaze for a moment. Yes, he'd intervened, gave him something that wasn't quite a smile, more of a look that contained a specific recognition, an acknowledgement of what this morning was and what it had taken to get here. He gave it back. She went back to the board members. Yes, he went back to making sure the equipment bay was ready for the walkthrough demonstration that was part of the morning's program. The formal ceremony was brief and honest, which was the instruction he'd heard Vivienne give the program development team when they'd been planning it. Brief and honest, inspiration speak. Poverty narrative framing. Just tell people what the program is and what it does. Dr. Osi spoke for 7 minutes and was the best speaker of the morning by a significant margin. A representative from one of the community college partners spoke for 4 minutes and was adequate. Vivienne spoke for 6 minutes and said nothing that wasn't true, which, in Ethan's experience, was harder than it sounded when you were standing in front of a room describing something you'd built. She didn't mention his name. She'd asked him weeks ago whether he wanted to be acknowledged, and he told her, and she'd accepted that without argument. Stood near the back of the room and listened to her, described the program's philosophy, that access to skilled work shouldn't be a function of what your family could afford, that technical competence was not a lesser form of intelligence. Path from working-class kid to sustainable career shouldn't require luck or a benefactor or an impossibly perfect set of circumstances, and he thought about the boy who'd asked him, "Does it actually work?" And about the uncle who'd been trying to get certified for 2 years. He thought about what it would have meant to him at 22 to walk into something that was designed around the actual shape of his life, rather than an imagined easier version of it. Kept that thought where it was, and let Vivienne finish. After the formal program, there was a reception and walkthrough, and he spent an hour in the training bay explaining equipment and module structure to families and students, and the occasional student and the occasional journalist who managed to find him despite his deliberate positioning away from the press area. He was not uncomfortable with it. He realized at some point in the middle of an explanation to a young woman who wanted to know how the certification process worked, actually good at this, at talking about the work in a way that made it real and accessible rather than technical and distancing. That surprised him slightly. It probably shouldn't have. It was the same quality that had made him good with machines, the ability to understand how a system worked and explain it to someone else in terms of what mattered rather than what was technically accurate. He just never applied it to anything that involved people before. He found Rosa afterward, still, in her chair near the entrance, having apparently been there for the full 2 hours, receiving a steady stream of people who had found their way to her through some social gravity he couldn't fully explain. She was talking to a woman about her age, who turned out to be one of the students' grandmothers. He waited until there was a break in the conversation. "How's your arm?" he asked. "Better," she said. "The cold's letting up." She looked at him carefully. "How are you?" "I'm good, Rosa." "That's not what I asked." He looked around the room at Sophie in the corner, explaining something earnestly to Jalen, at Marcus and Diane, talking to one of the community college representatives, at the families moving through the training bay with the particular quality of people who were beginning to believe a thing was real. "I'm genuinely good," he said. "Not managed good. Actual." She reached up and patted his hand, which was not a thing she did often. She said, "Now go. Find Vivienne. She's been looking for an excuse to come over here for 20 minutes and being very professional about not." He looked across the room. Vivienne was near the entrance talking to one of the board members, but her attention had drifted slightly in a way that he now recognized. He went to find her. She saw him come and wrapped up the conversation with the board member in a way that was smooth enough not to be rude and quick enough to be deliberate. They ended up near a corner of the reception area, slightly apart from the crowd, with the noise of the morning around them and a small pocket of quiet between them. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Rosa says you've been looking for an excuse to come over for 20 minutes. Vivienne glanced toward Rosa, who was absolutely not looking at them. "Your neighbor is perceptive," understatement. She looked at him. The professional mode was still present but lighter. Now, like a coat she was wearing open rather than buttoned. "Ethan, how are you actually feeling about today?" Thought about the boy at the diagnostic station. Does it actually work? And the uncle who couldn't afford the certification. Sophie saying you can feel what it is, what it's for. Like it was worth it, he said. The whole thing. All of it that was hard. He paused. That's not a small thing to be able to say. She looked at him for a moment, with the full attention she had, the real kind, not the professional kind. She said quietly, "It's not." They stood there for a moment. The morning moved around them. Someone's kid ran past, pursuing Jalen, who was apparently it, in a game that had spontaneously organized itself near the entrance. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "Okay. I'm going to decline the Oak Brook position." He'd made the decision 3 days ago, had known it was coming for longer than that, hadn't said it out loud yet. Because of this. He gestured at the room. Partly because of this. Mostly because it's not where I want to be. I want to be in the room where the program develops. I want to see the second cohort and fix the things the first cohort shows us are wrong. I want to build the adult track. She was listening carefully. That's a significant commitment. I know. I need us to talk about what that looks like structurally. Whether there's a real role here, what it pays, what my latitude is. I'm not doing open-ended anymore. I need specifics. She said it without hesitation. I'll have Derek put together a proper proposal by the end of next week. I'll negotiate it, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not accepting the first version. She almost smiled. I would expect nothing else. He looked at her. He thought about the restaurant on that first night, the white tablecloths, the jazz piano, the specific disorientation of finding her face across a table he'd walked into without knowing. He thought about all the conversations since. The coffee shop on Damon, the folders, and the legal process, and the Saturday meetings, and the Saturdays, the phone calls, that had become a regular thing because either of them had decided would, but because the alternative not talking started to feel like a choice that required effort. He thought about Claire, who had been gone for 9 years and who was still somewhere in the walls of his life, not as a presence he was waiting for, but as someone who had shaped him into the person he'd become and who he suspected would have found his particular brand of caution in the years, since both understandable and eventually ridiculous. He thought about the toolbox, the ring in the deep, flat drawer, the question of what somewhere better meant that he'd been living with for years without answering. He'd answered it recently. It had arrived quietly, the way real answers usually did, not as a dramatic realization, but as a simple fact that had been true for a while before he noticed it. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay, I've been keeping my late wife's wedding ring in my toolbox for 7 years. He said it plainly, the way he'd learned to say the true things. I told myself I was waiting until I knew where to put it. Something more appropriate, more intentional. He paused. I figured it out. I'm going to give it to Sophie. I'm going to tell her what it is and who her mother was and let her keep it. It should be hers. Vivienne held very still. She stopped. Started again more carefully. Why are you telling me this? He looked at her steadily. Because the reason I couldn't figure out what to do with it, the reason I kept it in a toolbox instead of somewhere it meant something, was that putting it somewhere intentional meant accepting that I was actually living. Forward instead of just managing the present. He paused. I'm living forward now. I wanted you to know that. The noise of the morning continued around them. Someone laughed loudly near the catering table. Jalen appeared briefly in Ethan's peripheral vision, still being chased. Vivienne looked at him with an expression he didn't have a clean name, for it was the kind of face that happened when a person received something they'd stopped expecting. I haven't been easy, he said, about any of this. I know that. You've been exactly as hard as made sense given what happened, she said. I wouldn't have trusted easy. I'm still not, he searched for the right word. I'm still not fully settled about your father, about the company, about what it means that the path back to something better ran through a cross-aviation program. I haven't resolved all of that. I know. I just don't want to wait for fully resolved before we... He stopped, recognizing that he was approaching the end of his sentence structure. He was better with machines than words at the far edges of things. I don't want to keep waiting, he said finally. She looked at him for a long moment. Okay, she said, just that. But the weight of it was not just that. Okay, he said, set. He found Sophie, 20 minutes later, at the edge of the training bay, looking at the diagnostic workstations with an expression he recognized, the same look she had when she was reading something difficult that she was refusing to let defeat her. You're thinking about engineering again, he said. I'm also thinking about pastry. I can hold two things. You absolutely can. He stood beside her. Can I tell you something? She looked up at him. The 12-year-old cool was fully present, but so was the other thing, the attention, the openness she kept behind it. I'm going to give you your mother's ring, he said. When we get home today, I want to tell you about her, the things I haven't told you yet, because I was protecting myself more than I was thinking about what you might want to know. And I want you to have something of hers that you can actually hold. Sophie went very still. She was quiet for long enough that he started to worry, which was the parent reflex. Assume. Stillness means something is wrong. She said quietly, I've wanted to ask about her ring for 2 years. I didn't know how to bring it up. He looked at his daughter. You could have just asked. I know. But you had the toolbox face whenever it came up. Toolbox face. Like you were somewhere else for a second. She looked at him carefully. You don't have that face today. He thought about that. I don't think I do. She leaned against him for a moment, not a hug, just the specific pressure of her shoulder against his arm. The way she'd been doing since she was small and didn't need to verbalize everything. He put his hand briefly on top of her head, which she would normally object to on the grounds of dignity, and which she let go today. They stood in the training bay that hadn't existed 8 months ago, in the middle of a morning that seven years ago he couldn't have imagined. The light came through the east side windows that still needed better fixtures and landed on the equipment that was real and functional and waiting for the students whose would arrive in 3 weeks. He thought about the thing he'd spent years believing, that moving forward meant leaving behind, that choosing new no's was a kind of betrayal of the things you'd lost. The right way to honor the past was to stay close enough to it that it remained visible. He'd carried that belief so long he'd stopped recognizing it as a belief. It had just felt like the shape of things. He understood now that it wasn't. Moving forward didn't erase anything. Sophie's mother was still in the walls of their life, in the way Sophie tilted her head when she was thinking, in the way Ethan had learned to love something with his whole attention rather than halfway. Those things didn't go away because he stopped circling them. They came with him. You didn't honor the past by staying in it. You honored it by becoming slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly, someone worth the surviving. That afternoon, after the morning had wound down and the families had gone, and the equipment bay was quiet again, and Sophie was in the back seat of the car telling him in detail about a conversation she'd had with one of the students who wanted to study. the same kind of systems she was interested in. He drove through the city in the particular golden light of a late April afternoon and thought about all the versions of this day he hadn't been able to imagine and felt, without working at it, something that was not complicated. He drove past Rose's building. Her light was on. He'd stop tomorrow. Bring her something from the bakery she liked on 21st Street, the one with the pan dulce she claimed was adequate and bought every week. He drove home. In the apartment, cupped, Sophie sat at the kitchen table, and he went to his room and opened the toolbox, the big one, the floor model, the one that had come with him through 3 apartments and 2 job changes, and that Sophie had once told him he treated with more care than the furniture, which was fair, and opened the deep flat-bottom drawer. The ring was there, in a small cloth pouch he'd made for it, years ago from a piece of Sophie's old baby blanket. Picked it up, felt its weight, carried it out to the kitchen. He sat down across from his daughter. He put the pouch on the table between them. He said her name was Claire. She was 26 when she died. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and immediately understood what everyone in it needed, which I told you. But I didn't tell you that she used it to make people feel completely seen, which is it sounds, and something you do too. Sophie was very still and very present. He talked for a long time. He told her the things he'd been protecting himself from saying, not the facts. Sophie knew most of the facts, but the texture of Claire, the way she laughed, the argument they'd had the week before the accident, something stupid and domestic, and how he'd replayed it for years as if replaying it differently would have changed the outcome. The way Sophie at 13 was beginning to look like her, around the eyes, in a way that still sometimes caught him off guard. Sophie listened. She asked questions, real ones, and he answered them. She cried once briefly, not dramatically, just her eyes filling, and one tear down before she blinked it back. He didn't rush past it. When he was done, he opened the pouch and put the ring on the table. "It's yours," he said. "You don't have to wear it. You don't have to do anything with it, but it should be with you." Sophie picked it up, turned it in her fingers. She was quiet for a long moment. "Thank you, Dad," she said. He nodded. He didn't trust his voice for a moment, which was fine. Some moments didn't require talking through. That evening, after dinner, he sat on the front steps of their building in the mild April air and texted Vivienne. Gave Sophie the ring today. Told her about Claire. It went well. Better than well. The reply came back after a few minutes. "I'm glad, really glad. I also meant what I said this morning. About not waiting." A longer pause. He watched the street. Kid on a bicycle. The corner store. The ordinary Pilsen evening. "Too," she wrote. "I've meant it for a while." "I know," he typed. "I think I was the last one to catch up. You got there. Eventually. That counts," she wrote. And he smiled at that, because it was exactly what Sophie had said, and he thought about the two of them saying it, and what it meant that the most important people in his life were telling him the same thing from completely different directions. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked up at the street and the sky above it, still faintly lit at the edges from a sun that had gone down an hour ago. The city made its ordinary sounds. Somewhere nearby someone was cooking something that smelled like garlic and hot oil. Kid on the bicycle came back the other direction. 7 years. You couldn't get them back. He'd learned that and kept learning it, the way you keep learning things that are true in more ways than you understood when you first knew them. 7 years of Sophie growing up, of Rose's strokes and recoveries, Marcus's wedding, and Jalen's whole life to date, of machines he'd fixed, and jobs he'd worked, and lunches he'd packed before sunrise. All of it was real. All of it had mattered. None of it was wasted time, even the years when it had felt like nothing but maintenance. But he was 32 years old, and there was a program with a waiting list for its second cohort, and a girl in her room holding her mother's ring, and a woman in a River North condo who had spent 7 years becoming someone worth knowing, and who had spent a significant portion of the last several months demonstrating, with patience and honesty and a specific kind of dignity, that some things could be rebuilt if both people were willing to pick up the materials. He was willing. He was, finally, more than willing. He stood up from the steps, went inside, climbed the stairs. On Sophie's door. Yeah? He opened the door. She was at her desk, the ring on the surface, beside her homework, visible but not intrusive, placed, he thought, position of something you want to be able to see while you're doing other things. "Pasta for dinner," he said, "or I can order something." She considered this with appropriate gravity. Pasta, but the good version with the shallots. I only make one version. Then make that one. He went to make it. He heard her chair push back, heard her footsteps in the hall, heard her appear in the kitchen doorway. Yeah, today was a good day. He looked at his daughter in the kitchen doorway, 13 next month. Her mother's eyes, her own particular self that was like no one else, and like everyone who had loved her in some composite way he couldn't have predicted. It was. He turned on the burner. The water started its slow work toward boiling. Sophie sat at the table and picked up a pencil and went back to whatever problem she'd been working on before he knocked. Yes, elite. And the apartment filled with the effrontery sounds of a weeknight, the heat, the street below, the scratch of a pencil on paper, the smell of shallots beginning to soften in a pan. Cooked. He was not a man who had found his way back to who he used to be. He was someone different now, shaped by the years, by the loss, used by the work, by all the early mornings and the difficult choices and the things he'd survived that he'd never have chosen. He was a man who had learned that careful wasn't the same as safe, that managing wasn't the same as living, and that the people who mattered were worth the specific terror of letting them matter fully. He wasn't finished figuring it out. He didn't expect to be. He was moving forward now, in the real sense of it, not away from what he'd lost, but carrying it with him into something he was choosing on purpose. Was enough, more than enough. The water came to a boil. He put the pasta in.